Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. FPL Vincenzo here, and this pod's going to be sort of a slight recap pod, I'll call it. I tend to look ahead on most of my videos, talk about the upcoming game week, talk about future decisions, and not talk about previous decisions and the weeks that have gone. I think most people that listen to pods don't really care about a person's team the week before, how well they did, how happy they were with the transfers they made. But I think it's quite good as a little case study sometimes to look back at a move you made, the reasons you made it, and learn from that in terms of going forward. And I think game week 12 is a really pivotal week for this because obviously Gabriel got injured on international duty. I had spent most of the week following that injury on social media, talking to friends, talking to others in the community, even on some spaces on Twitter, saying that Van Dijk, I had no interest in bringing Van Dijk in as the replacement. I really didn't want him. There was lots of reasons why I didn't want him. And I was pretty consistent with that message for 4 or 5 days last week. Then on Friday night, I kind of was in a position where I had to make a decision. Gabriel was dropping in price and he became my priority transfer of the player I needed to move out of my team with my transfer. Obviously, I had lots of options on players I could bring in. I was fairly clear all week. I was looking to go sideways to another Arsenal defender. Realistically, it would have been Timber. Munoz was on radar. There were a few other defenders on radar, even a downgrade to Nathan Collins, who I've spoken about on recent pods being a good pickup. I was thinking about getting him in. And ultimately, on Friday night, I got Van Dijk in, despite all week not wanting him. And even now, there's lots of reasons why I look at him in my team and I still don't want him. Nothing's really changed in my opinion, in my approach, in my mindset towards him. That I didn't think he was necessarily a great pick on Friday and I still bought him. And I still don't think he's necessarily a great pick now. But there were reasons why I brought him in. And for me, I think it was quite refreshing to look back on last year. I obviously had an incredibly high rank last year, top 4K finish. And I went back and had a look at how I'd played last year, the sort of decisions I made and why I made them. And I went back to a couple of examples, particularly Matthias Cunha earlier in the year. Wolves hadn't been very good. Nothing about him screamed out that he was a must-buy. His data was average at best. He wasn't shooting very much. His XG per game wasn't incredibly high. Wolves were coming into improved fixtures, but it was still Wolves. And I was thinking, I don't really want you. And I can't remember exactly. I think at the time, someone like Dom Solanke looked a better pick. But it may have been someone else. I can't remember. But Cunha certainly wasn't my number one choice in that position. But looking at it from a wider lens and from all perspectives, I kind of still brought him in. And luckily, he did quite well. I think a lot of games he had one shot that happened to go in or 2 shots and one was a really low XG and he'd score a 30-yard screamer or something. Then he'd get max bonus for his goal as well. And for the 4 or 5 weeks I owned Cunha, I did quite well. And maybe there was some luck in there. Maybe there was some variance in there that he got returns in those moments. But there was a reason why I bought him. And that developed into, obviously, a good outcome for me. And I was trying to remember that when it comes to this decision on a defender, that the person that you want to bring in, the person you feel like has got the higher ceiling, the person you feel like could give you more points, the person that feels like it's the more maverick, the more exciting pick, isn't always the best, isn't always the most sensible. And I think it challenged me on Friday night last week between, we play this game for fun, right? We want to finish as high as we can, but ultimately we play for fun. That doesn't mean to say the choice you make is always the fun choice. I think there's times here to be different. There's times here to take a risk. There's times here to be aggressive, we'll call it. And there's times here where being sensible, but maybe being a bit dull is the way to play. Now, some people will take the dull template, safe route 90% of the time, and they'll probably finish top 50k quite consistently to do that. I don't want to finish top 50k. I'm playing to win. I'm playing to finish top 1k. I don't really care if I finish 100k, 200k. I'm not protecting a legacy. My record is good over 20 years of playing FPL, but I'm not protecting a legacy. I'm playing to do as well as I can. But even with that attitude and that sort of cavalier approach, we'll call it, it's still important, I think, remember that at times it makes sense to be sensible. It makes sense to do the right thing. And I just wanted to talk through here on why I reached the decision I did on Van Dijk. And this might help me in upcoming game weeks. I think there'll be opportunities in the next block to, again, be aggressive, take risks. And maybe in some of those situations, that will still be the choice I make. But I think it's just good sometimes to look at why you made a transfer from all angles. See if you're still happy with the choice you made now, even without the outcome bias of 1 week, because obviously Van Dijk didn't do very well against Nottingham Forest. And to help us as listeners and me myself here, who's sort of having a little brain dump with you, to make better decisions going forward and to think, make sure you're thinking clearly when you're making sort of future transfers. So the stance I took here when assessing Van Dijk was what I'll call 4 E's. So I was looking at evidence. I was looking at eye test. So the evidence is more data driven. Eye test, what I could see when I've watched Liverpool, and I've seen quite a lot of them lately. Expectation in terms of the upcoming fixtures, and then edge, whether this transfer was going to offer me something that was worth the risk. So I tried to take it from those 4 angles, beginning with E, and see where we reached. So on the screen right now is obviously the evidence. And there was little in here from Liverpool to make me think he was a good choice. Over the whole season, Liverpool were considered the 9th best defence in terms of data, 13.93 expected goals conceded in the first 11 game weeks. The big chances conceded was 29, which was 18th. Goals conceded was 17, was 13th, and 3 clean sheets in 11. So in most of the metrics, they're in the middle, but they conceded quite a lot of big chances. Obviously, don't have their first choice goalkeeper as well, up until that point. Then you look specifically at the shorter term, the last 6, to see if recent form is better or worse than the whole season average. And it's clearly worse. They're the worst for big chances conceded in the last 6 game weeks. They're the 3rd worst for XGC, and they're the 5th worst for goals conceded, just 1 clean sheet in 6. So looking at this in terms of the evidence of the data, Liverpool, they may have won the league last year. People may sort of hold them in high regard because of their longer term success. But looking at them solely over this season, I think 11 game weeks is a big enough sample size here. The defence clearly isn't clicking. Something's up with how they're defending. They're giving away far too many big chances. And if anything, things are getting worse lately, despite the fact they kept a clean sheet against Real Madrid, kept a clean sheet against Villa. And there were green shoots there of maybe people believing Liverpool had improved. I think the last 6 weeks of data as a combination here suggests that they're not really improved. If anything, they're getting worse. So, yeah, defence been average at best all season. The fact that the worst team in the whole league in the last 6 game weeks of giving away big chances is a worry, because that's obviously going to have a big detriment towards them keeping clean sheets. And I think anytime you buy a defender, I know we're kind of a bit blinded by DEFCON this year. Sometimes we get carried away and excited by attacking threat. But when we own defenders, the bread and butter is the clean sheets. People give Raya a hard time for being a 2 or a 6 merchant in goal. But if he's keeping clean sheets in 70, 80% of fixtures and you're getting 6 points more than you're getting 2, I think that's still more than happy. If you're seeing 6 points from your goalkeeper and 6 points from your defenders in your FPL team every week, I think you're more than happy. So Liverpool's clean sheet chances are clearly low here when they're giving up the most big chances in the league. So from an evidence perspective, there wasn't really much there to support Van Dijk and get excited about owning him. Then obviously I looked at his DEFCON, which is obviously a big thing amongst defenders this year. And again, there's no consistency or trend here. He had it in 6 of the first 11 weeks, which is reasonable. Probably slightly above average for Premier League defenders, I would say. Even amongst Premier League centre-backs, it's slightly above average, but it's not that top-tier level with the Senessis and Joachim Andersons and players like that. I don't think you would have, or I certainly don't have trust in Van Dijk in any game at the moment getting DEFCON. I think he will get it from time to time. He obviously did get it in the game with Forest in the end. But with other defenders, I think you expect it every week. You're basically putting them on a 4-point floor every week. And if they get a clean sheet and get more than 4 points, amazing. If they get a yellow card or concede too many goals and get less than 4 points, so be it. But the floor is 4. I'm still putting the floor at 2 for Van Dijk. So even though he's got DEFCON here against Bournemouth, Newcastle, Everton, Palace, Man United, Brentford, so there's no consistency in terms of the type of opponent, home versus away. It's good that he gets it more than others, but you can't rely on it and you can't plan for it. So I'm kind of putting him in the camp a little bit where I've got Malik Thiaw at the moment in my draft as well from Newcastle. I own Christian Romero earlier in the season. And Van Dijk right now feels like a similar version to them. I own those for reasonable fixtures, thinking that there's a reasonable chance of clean sheets here based on the fixtures. They could get some DEFCON, but it's not reliable. And in most cases with Thiaw and Romero, I didn't get the DEFCON. So obviously we'll see with some patience with Van Dijk how much he gets lately. It started with it against Forest, but I wouldn't put him in that top tier category for DEFCON. But you probably put it as it's fine. It's not amazing, but it's fine. Then you go on to the eye test here and how Liverpool are playing overall, but particularly how they're setting up defensively. And there was 4 sort of main takeaways for me, 4 bullet points that I thought were worth sharing and were sort of going around in my head going into last week. Why are they conceding so many big chances? Why are they one of the worst defences in the league? And the easy answer is to blame Konate, because obviously confidence is a bit low at the moment. Maybe he's not playing to the level that we've come to expect. Or blame Kirkes, who's obviously new to the team, getting used to a new style of play, new responsibilities, slightly adapted role. Maybe those 2 things are factors, but there are other sort of underlying factors as well. So the first one is Liverpool's setup. And I've touched on it, I think, in other pods, but Liverpool are different in the way they mark and press. So most teams in most phases of play now are going man for man in terms of marking and pressing. Liverpool don't, particularly in their defensive line with Konate and Van Dijk. Clearly, the instruction from Arne Slot here is that they have to have a spare player. So typically Konate marks and Van Dijk sweeps behind him, which is fine to have that spare player in the defensive line as effectively as like a sweeper. Issue being that if Liverpool have an overload in that part of the pitch, in that 2v1, that means that somewhere else on the pitch, the other team have an overload. And what the consequence is that other teams are playing through the Liverpool press much easier because there's always a spare man. What really needs to happen is Van Dijk marks that one striker. Konate maybe moves into holding midfield or out to fullback or something in certain phases of play to mark someone as well. That might free up Conor Bradley to push further forward to mark, or free up Gravenberch to play 10 yards higher to go and mark. And that spare player the opponent has in terms of playing out is suddenly not there. It's putting more pressure on Liverpool to win a 1v1 duel. And I heard Jamie Carragher saying on Sky that one of Liverpool's problems right now is they're not winning enough duels. And that could be a consideration as well. But the likes of Van Dijk and Konate really have all the attributes to win duels. They're big, they're physical, they should win their headers, they shouldn't get muscled off the ball, they're fairly quick, so they shouldn't be people running in behind them. You'd argue Liverpool need to trust the players more with their attributes and skill sets to be able to cope 1v1. Because the system, the way it is right now in Liverpool's defensive shape, is allowing opponents to play through them quite easily because there's a spare man available in the build-up. That's not helping Liverpool. Teams are getting at the back 4 because of that. Also, Liverpool have this problem. So again, the defender isn't pushing into midfield to help that part of the press. Also, the pressing further up the pitch with Salah and players like that are not necessarily lazy in the press, but stay in a high line, means that Liverpool are getting overloaded. What a lot of teams do right now, my team, Aston Villa, are very good at this, that they're looking to overload the middle of the pitch and have a numbers advantage in that part of the pitch. Villa do it by starting John McGinn in a wide position, but he comes in field and plays quite narrow. If you look at the Villa midfield against Leeds the weekend, it was Kamara and Tielemans as the 2 central midfield players, McGinn and Buendia as the 2 wide midfield players, and Morgan Rogers as a number 10. What tended to happen from Villa, and happens quite a lot from Villa, is that Buendia and Rodgers, Buendia and McGinn from those wide areas play quite narrow. Digne and Cash from fullback hold the width instead. Rodgers also comes deeper to help with the build-up as well. So Villa basically have 5 central midfielders when they're building up the play. The 2 actual central midfielders, the 10 and the 2 wide midfielders. Because of the way Liverpool play, and they don't have the system right now to help nullify opponents that do that. So I say defenders don't push into midfield to help provide more bodies in midfield. The wide players tend to stay quite wide. In Salah's case, he tends to move to a central position from a wide starting berth. And if anything, that drags the right central midfielder wide because Salah's not marking his winger or something like that. So Liverpool play with, we'll call it 3 central midfielders, the 2 deeper ones, Gravenberch and McAllister normally, and the more advanced one, whoever that's going to be, Szoboszlai most of the season. But they're not getting help from a Gakpo out wide or necessarily a Wirtz out wide or a Salah out wide or a Konate pressing up from defence. So Liverpool's 3 very much play as a 3 in midfield, and other teams are putting 4 or 5 people into that same zone. And understandably, for the 3 in there, they're outnumbered and teams play through them. So that's not helping. And that, again, is giving teams the ability to play out from the back, to play through the Liverpool press and get into Liverpool's half and into their final third where obviously goals can be scored. The peak Liverpool team, obviously under Jurgen Klopp, were very intense with their pressing. Mane, a younger Salah at the time, and Firmino were very good at putting pressure on defenders. Henderson, Wijnaldum backed them up incredibly well. And Fabinho was there as sort of the protection. Robertson and Trent also pressed up. And Liverpool committed a lot of bodies forward to a higher press. And it worked very well. It might be the changing dynamics of the league and teams more willing to play long ball and things like that now. But Liverpool's press, as with most teams, to be honest, it suffers a bit from that intensity. Maybe it's necessary because of the pure volume of fixtures now, that the more intense Liverpool and others play, the more common injuries are and things like that. So maybe that style of football isn't as possible now to carry on pressing in that way. But Liverpool are not getting a lot of pressure on the ball. So teams are getting more opportunity to play out from the back, play through the lines, find players in overloaded positions. And that's, again, not helping Liverpool win the ball back high up the pitch to create scoring opportunities for themselves. But it's also allowing teams to break on them. And I do think Liverpool, the final thing, especially in midfield, I think do suffer a bit of physicality. Gravenberch, McAllister, particularly, are not overly big. They're physical enough, but they're not Declan Rice sort of levels of physicality or things like that. They lack a bit of size. They lack a bit of stature. And again, I think in a real physical game, you can get at Liverpool. So I don't think that's helping them either. They can be a bit weak in the middle. I think Chelsea suffer a bit from this as well. I think just a little bit weak in the spine of the team. And if you play a certain type of game, get long balls, physicality into that midfield area, I think Liverpool will lose that battle in more games than not. I think that they could do with someone like an Amadou Onana provides for Villa, just someone with size, physicality. Can they get that player? So I don't think all of those things from an eye test perspective are helping Liverpool. And again, allowing players or opponents' players to break on them to get into their half and create chances. So from an eye test perspective, Liverpool aren't doing well. And there's no sign right now that that's going to improve. It'd be different if the data was bad, but you was noticing something from an eye test perspective that promised improvement. But I was looking at it and thinking, results are bad, but nothing's really changing here to make this better. Liverpool aren't pushing a defender into midfield, aren't picking a more physical midfield, aren't changing the pressing dynamic of Salah and players like that, which could have a good impact on how the team set up defensively. Then, obviously, I moved on to expectation. And the next 6 games from game week 12 onwards looked fairly good from a defensive perspective. None of the teams they were playing ranked particularly well for XG. And most of them actually were in the bottom 5 or 6 teams for XG. So Forest, obviously the game finished 3-0, but going into that game, they were the 10th best XG in the league, so very mid-table. They've got West Ham next, who are 14th, then Sunderland 17th, Leeds 13th, Brighton 7th, Tottenham 15th. So coming up now, in 4 of the next 5 game weeks, Liverpool are playing, what we're looking at there, 4 of the worst 8 teams in the league for creating chances, you'd like to think there's some element of clean sheets here and possibilities, because they're playing against teams that are struggling to create chances, certainly struggling to create good chances. And even though Liverpool are giving up quite a high volume of big chances right now, as we saw earlier, you still like to think that in some of these games, they'll do a better job. So from a data perspective, these fixtures look quite good. What I have also been quite keen to do, though, is not get too drawn into what I'll call the general fixture tickers, because a lot of those are based on factors that I don't know. But I'm quite keen myself to have 2 fixture tickers. I have it on my spreadsheet in my own sort of analysis. 2 different colour fixture tickers, one for defence and one for attack, because what's a good fixture for Liverpool against West Ham could be very good from an attacking standpoint and medium for an attacking standpoint. So understandably, I think the fixture tickers for Liverpool, West Ham would put that as probably a green fixture for Liverpool. And I wouldn't argue that it's a green fixture for Liverpool's attack. But looking at this here, I think for their defence, it's probably a yellow fixture. So I have 2 different fixture tickers depending if I'm buying an attacking player or a defensive player. So I try not to get roped into looking at the general fixture tickers, which would show Liverpool having quite a lot of green at the moment, and just purely relying on that before making a choice. And the other thought I had here is that I touched on this last week, is that Liverpool's strength right now, clearly player for player, they have one of the best squads in the league, if not the best team in the league. Quite a lot of moments attackers that in any moment could win Liverpool a game. Van Dijk and Konate as pure defenders have all the attributes you'd want from a good centre-back. Clearly in midfield, they've got energy, mobility and playmaking. But the question I've been asking myself for a while is, and I haven't quite got around to doing a pod on this, is how relevant is having the better players this year? Because matches are now more direct, because matches are more about physicality, a bit more reliance on set pieces, a bit more reliance on moments, less reliance on sort of a play style running a game. So this isn't Pep Guardiola tick-attacker, having 70% possession, pinning the opponent back in their own final third, not letting them out with intense pressure. In that sort of situation, Man City are going to win 70-80% of matches against anyone. Fair enough, they could get hit by lose to a set piece, suck a punch on transition, counter-attack, mistake by a particular player or something, they could lose 1-0. But that style of play gave Manchester City a very high chance of winning a higher volume of games. The best teams now are not playing in a style that lends itself to that. Liverpool and Man City both more willing than ever to defend in a deep block. They're defending in a deep block. That means opponents are spending more time in their half, more time around their penalty box. As I said, the pressing levels have dropped off, and pressing levels dropping off means games are less reliant on transition. That means Liverpool's best players in attack aren't getting quite as much space because they're not winning the ball back high up the pitch with the defending team sort of out of shape. So all of Liverpool's possession and things like that now are largely against breaking down a whole team rather than winning the ball back in the final third and having to break down just the defence. That's not helping. So I think lots of games now are more 50-50 than they've ever been. Clearly, the teams with the better players still do have an edge, and some teams still do have slightly better tactics than the other. But that gap between the best and the worst has massively reduced this season. So the better teams now are probably 60% likely to win a game, 55% more likely to win a game rather than the 70s and 80% I would have probably put on them a couple of years ago. Might be a reason why the league table's so tight and the likes of Crystal Palace, Sunderland, Brighton are all well in the mix to finish in the Champions League, because they've got good tactics, they've got quite good players. The players aren't quite as good as what the better teams have with more resources, but because the tactics now are so close, the gap between the better teams and the weaker teams isn't as high. So I think there is something to bear in mind in that the weight I put on fixtures when making decisions now is less than it probably has been in the past, because normally I would have said, okay, that team's very highly likely to win that game or this run of games. Now I'm not so confident because of sort of the closing of the gap between the best teams and the worst team, and how tactically football has changed into this season. Final point to weigh up here was the edge. So Van Dijk is now the 5th most owned defender in the game, roughly 27%. And I had a decision to make. Did I want a piece of that? Because on most of the other evidence so far that we've looked at, his data isn't very good. So I asked myself first, this is a defender spot. Do I want one of my defender spots to be a sword or a shield? My general rule of thumb, I don't stick to this religiously every week, but my general rule of thumb is to try and have sort of 2 non-template players, maybe 3 non-template players that are going to be my differentials to play against the field. I had Mbeumo at the start of this year when many didn't. He's not such a sword in my team anymore. He's more a shield. So now I need a different sword who I'm going to use to take on the masses with. Did I want that spot to be a defender? In which case I could put a Munoz in, or I could put another attacking defender in to be a sword. But I'm quite happy, I think. I was quite happy just to stick to this pot as being a shield spot. That narrowed me down really towards another Arsenal defender to replace Gabriel. But I was also then in the mindset that I've already got Raya and Saka. I've got no plans to move them on anytime soon. And if I went to Timber, I've obviously tripled up on Arsenal again, which is fine. But at the moment, if Gabriel does come back in 3 game weeks, 4 game weeks, realistically, I'm going to want him back pretty much immediately. Once I've moved to Timber, I'm limiting myself to the fact that I'll have to use Timber to get back to Gabriel because I need to free up an Arsenal spot, etc., etc. This player that I'm bringing in now, was it going to be instantly Gabriel to this player, and then when Gabriel is back, just do the reverse? Wasn't convinced I wanted to do that. Senesi's output is dwindling lately. Is it possible that when Gabriel is back, it's Senesi I want to move to Gabriel? I've got Thiaw in my team. Newcastle are very unpredictable at the moment. I don't necessarily mind having him. The fixtures are fine, but I don't necessarily view him either as a long-term hold right now. Could be, but I'm not fixated on that. So he could become Gabriel. By going to Timber, I was blocking myself from moving Thiaw, Alderate, or Senesi in my case to Gabriel. I didn't want to reduce myself to that. So by going to Van Dijk or to Munoz, then Gabriel could be brought back from anyone. So that put me off getting Timber in. So Munoz suddenly become not really an option because this was a shield spot and I saw him more as a sword. Timber wasn't an option because it was reducing my defender transfer capabilities down the line. Then you look at what's coming up fixture-wise. A lot of teams have got a lot of fixtures in a short time now, midweek and weekend consistently, whether that's Europe in midweek. There's a midweek round the Premier League games. There's a couple of League Cup games, etc., etc. Although centre-backs are going to be least impacted, I think, by fixture congestion than attacking players, there still might be some rotation. You look at it, Liverpool have got barely any defenders fit right now. And even if they have got a lot of defenders available, you expect Van Dijk to play all the games. So he ticks the box for being a shield. He's got a high... he's owned by quite a lot of teams. That makes him a shield. In theory, the fixtures are reasonable. That covers against that I have a piece of the Liverpool defence in case things improve. He's not blocking me from getting Gabriel back from anyone. And he's fairly nailed, or as nailed as anyone else is going to be when it comes to these fixtures over this run. So I just came around to the conclusion here that, and I'm going to jump on quickly onto this slide. These were the sort of 6 areas I was trying to analyse Van Dijk. From Liverpool's defence point of view, the evidence I'd seen, they were a red team. Nothing in the data is encouraging. Big chances conceded, the worst in the league lately. DEFCON is middling, slightly above middling, so I'll put that as yellow. Attacking threat, he obviously did score and it was disallowed against Man City, but his underlying data, his XGI for the season is quite low. He's not amongst the most likely defenders to score this season, but we can't hide from the fact he's 6'6" or whatever he is, and he has some threat. But probably people that were keen to bring him in probably overplayed that as a reason to get him. I think he's probably no more or less likely to score at the moment than any other defender in general. all centre-backs go forward from corners. Of course, all of them could score in a moment. Michael Keane scored for people last week. I wouldn't necessarily still call him a high upside XGI attacking defender. Van Dijk's probably more in that boat. So I put that as orange. Eye test, Liverpool have still got lots of problems. So I'll put that as orange. Fixtures I've put as green, not because of the fixture tickers, but because of the data. The teams they're playing against are largely not great for XG. And the edge is minimal because he's still over 25% owned. He's not, I wouldn't call him a differential. So you look at these 6 metrics, he's got 1 good, 1 bad, and all the others in the middle. It's not a glowing sort of light on him here that I must bring him in. Realistically here, when I'm making a transfer in normal circumstances, I think I'd want 3 of these 6 to be green, maybe 4 of these 6 to be green. And I think that's the point moving forward here, that if I was making a transfer I'd want to make, I'd be looking at someone where 3 or 4 things are in their favour right now, not 1. And there was maybe Nathan Collins would have been good for Brentford's defensive data was good. His DEFCON was good. Attacking threat is there right now. On eye test, he's in amongst it from the long throws. Brentford's fixtures are fairly good, and he's 1% owned. He would have been green or yellow in all 6 of those metrics, I think, if I'd have done the same analysis I've just done for Van Dijk, for Nathan Collins. So the transfer I wanted to make really was to bring him in. But I look at it and think Brentford are quite unreliable. He's 1% owned. How much damage is he really going to do if he does really well? Fair enough, it'll be a missed opportunity. But that's a big risk to punt Nathan Collins over Virgil van Dijk here. And do I trust Nathan Collins enough over Virgil van Dijk to take that risk? Ultimately, I didn't. And I decided to play it safe and take the sensible transfer rather than the move I wanted to make. In the aftermath of what's happened, obviously Munoz did very well. Timber got an assist and probably should have had a clean sheet as well. Van Dijk was awful, or not so much him directly, but Liverpool were awful. But I'm still not really regretting my choice because the reasons I picked him still stand. And I'm not going to get too swept up in short-term outcome bias and people saying, oh, look, I got Munoz, you got Van Dijk. I said you should have got Munoz, and there's a 10-point swing this week. Munoz may still outscore Van Dijk over this period, but we can't predict 12, 13 pointers for defenders, I don't think. So there's an outcome bias to go with that. I still think Van Dijk is the more sensible pick than Munoz for my team right now. And sort of recapping to what I did so well last year to get my best ever finish was I got better at largely making sensible moves. In the past, I've been, I would say, slightly maverick, slightly upside chasing. And I still did quite well doing that, but I probably could have done quite a lot of 100k finishes in my history. But none of the big sort of top 10k finishes, because ultimately I take 1 or 2 too many punts that don't end up working out. I think I was getting that way a little bit earlier in the year when I bought Foden in for Burnley. That was an example of sort of old Craig coming back out. I think I need to get back into the habit of doing sensible things with the odd calculated risk rather than loads of calculated risk with the odd sensible move. I think my balance has become a bit out, and putting Van Dijk in is back towards a sensible thing. The other thought is here, I say flexibility and looking at the bigger picture is key. Van Dijk's minutes are secure. And flexibility-wise, if I want Gabriel back, it still doesn't have to be from him. That's quite important. So I wanted to keep that. And I think it's very easy in FPL to block yourself down a certain path or back yourself into a certain corner, which then forces you to do certain moves, which might not make sense when you could be more flexible. Maybe that's going to change this year because we're going to get the 5 free transfers in game week 16. That gives you a chance to fix things that are wrong and sort of improve your flexibility because you've got 5 transfers. But I don't really want to use my transfers in that way. And finally, I said, just to talk about my own team here, but exciting moves aren't always the best. Going into game week 11, I had 2 free transfers. I was going to leave Gabriel on the bench, and I would have ended up just playing Thiago instead, who got 4 points because he got some DEFCON against Newcastle. And my planned move was to do Joel Pedro to Thiago and to do Dewsbury Hall up to Ismail Assar. I would have played 3-4-3. And obviously, that would have, on paper, going into the game week, Sarr would have looked better than Dewsbury Hall. And Pedro to Thiago was kind of setting myself up for the longer term. Obviously, I've been a bit lucky here with the variance, but I've ended up playing Dewsbury Hall and he's got 13 points for Everton against Man United. Sarr continued his run of unfortunate blanks in that Wolves game. So I actually would have been worse off if I'd have got Munoz, or if I'd have stuck to my original plan of doing the 2 moves and playing. I'd have ended up playing TL. I'd have had less points. So again, 1 week, it's outcome bias on the flip side. So I don't want to be a hypocrite here, but if I'd have done the more exciting move in a transfer I wanted to make, I was concerned. I think Sarr was the player I feared for this next block, starting against Wolves. He could have got points, he didn't. And I've been lucky that my alternative, who's someone who was more of a placeholder and just a squad pick rather than someone I expected to play a lot, has ended up getting 13 points when I've needed them. But just some visual evidence that doing the exciting move and the wanted move isn't always best. So yeah, that's kind of it for this one. Just wanted to talk about that process really, and so we're coming up to a run now where we'll be making quite a lot of transfers in the next 5 or 6 weeks. We've obviously got to use all of our free transfers by the game week 15 deadline, so there'll be a chance to maybe make some luxury moves in that period. In game week 16, we'll have 5 free transfers, so again, people might be keen and to get those used up quickly and to play like a mini wild card. And I just thought it'd be good to share this process, looking at these 4 E's when you make a move and think, is this the player I really want? Why am I doing this transfer? Do I want to make this transfer, but is it a sensible move? What perspective am I getting them in for? Am I purely looking at things only from a fixtures standpoint? I don't think that's a good way to do it. I think you want a wider look when we're making transfers. So yeah, this was just a little case study, sort of a week later in the aftermath of Van Dijk's failure against Forest. But I'm still happy that I made the decision for the right reasons. I'm still happy that I'm not happy to have him as such, because I don't think his upside's the same. I think Liverpool's expectations are minimal, but covering the risk and having that shield pick was more important to me in that spot in my team right now, rather than chasing points. And sometimes you have to rein it back a little bit and look at the bigger picture, and think I've done that for the right reasons and not get swept up in outcome bias, because particularly after 1 week. So yeah, thanks for listening to that. Hope that helps you make your transfers moving forward and gives you a different perspective on what a good transfer is and how you want to play it. My next pod's going to be on sort of luxury moves and transfer plans for the next block. I'm aware that we're coming into a period here where I can already anticipate a new bandwagon coming and how things are going to be going and how other managers are going to start doing things. I always like to be 1 or 2 steps ahead and sort of know what's coming before it's actually happened. Pod might come out this week, it might come out next week, but Dewsbury Hall is actually a part of this pod. It's going to end up being a part of that one as well in terms of my team and using that as a demonstration in terms of what I'm thinking. So look out for that one in the next 7 days or so. But until then, thanks for listening, and I'll speak to you all soon. Cheers.